1969, Parliament voted overwhelmingly in favour of permanently abolishing the death penalty for murder. 2 years later, capital punishment was also removed for arson in a Royal Naval dockyard. Now, hanging only remained for treason and piracy. Britain's new position was soon followed by other Western countries, like France and Spain, which through the 1970s would also stop using the death penalty. Even the USA, which hadn't executed anyone since 1967, suspended capital punishment in 1972.
In America, the instrument for the temporary abolition of the death penalty was not Congress, it was the Supreme Court, the one part of the government of America which is not susceptible to re-election. It was that body that actually declared that at least the process of executions in America was unconstitutional.
The Supreme Court's decision infuriated the majority of Americans.
Private papers of the Chief Justice, who was in the dissent, indicate that he thought that was the end of the death penalty in America, as did most of the abolitionists. They thought they had won their permanent victory. They couldn't have been more wrong. And the states immediately, responding to overwhelming public support for the death penalty and outrage at the United States Supreme Court decision, reenacted death penalty statutes.
In 1976, the Supreme Court was forced to review its decision in response to widespread public pressure.
Less than 2 years ago, death cells in prisons throughout America were emptied when the Supreme Court ruled against capital punishment. The court decided that it was unconstitutional because it was a cruel and unusual form of punishment, in the sense that it was so arbitrary. Some people would be sentenced to death and others merely to a term of imprisonment for the same offence. Now, though, the court is having to think again, and while it's doing so, death rows throughout the country are filling up again.
The Supreme Court voted to reinstate capital punishment. And in 1977, Gary Gilmore became the first person to be executed in the US for 10 years.
Gilmore eventually insisted that the state of Utah put him to death. So he was the first of many volunteers from death row, basically people who could save their own lives by continuing to appeal and to have their cases reviewed and have their cases delayed. He took the opposite path. He volunteered. The state of Utah put him to death, and from that day onwards, the execution pattern began once again in the USA. Very slowly at first. In 1977 there was only 2, and then in the early 1980s there were a handful each year. But by the end of the 1990s, there was almost 100 people being put to death each year.
Gilmore was executed by a firing squad in Utah. Since then, other US states have chosen to use the gas chamber or lethal injection to carry out death sentences. Gilmore's execution hit the headlines in the